We are going to energise the country.
Stop Brexit.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Seamus, I'm not sure this is a great idea, is it?
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. I'm your host Will, and in this episode I'm delighted to be joined by Liberal Democrats' prospective parliamentary candidate for Edinburgh East, Jill Reilly. Welcome to the podcast.
Good afternoon, nice to be here.
So to begin with, I'd like to ask, Edinburgh East has been a seat that hasn't been held by the Liberal Democrats before. How confident are you of taking the seat, or at least doing well?
So, I think, it's interesting times at the moment. We beat both the Tories and Labour in the recent European elections in Edinburgh East, which, was really great for us. The SNP do have quite a good majority, but I know that the people of Edinburgh East voted to stay in the EU and to stay in the UK, and we are the only party standing on that promise. So obviously we are realistic, but we are playing to win. So I think the fact that we are the only party standing on that promise to stay in Europe and the UK is really resonating. And also, I'm a fresh face, not stood before, and people are a bit disillusioned with existing politicians. So yeah, it's been a good campaign.
One of the things that perhaps has been a bit divisive in terms of the public's reaction to the Liberal Democrats has been the policy of revoking Article 50 rather than going for a second referendum. Which do you think would be the best option to go for if the Liberal Democrats are in a position either to decide who the next government are or to actually form the next government?
So our position was always to have a people's vote, and that still remains. However, we added the extra scenario of if we won a majority and created the government and it was a Liberal Democrat government, then we would revoke Article 50 as a means of putting, Brexit on hold and getting on with what matters to people. We are a party that believes in staying in Europe, so we would not waste time questioning that if we had won, through a democratic event, if we had won that. The people's vote has always been our policy and still remains that if in a situation where we're not the majority government, and that is obviously maybe looking a bit more likely now given the polling. So that remains our policy for the people's vote. And as you say, if we are working with other parties, then we would push for that after the 12th.
Why do you think that since the European elections, which you mentioned at the start, why do you think that since the European elections earlier this year, the Liberal Democrats haven't maintained the same amount of percentage points in the polls that they did during those elections? I think there were certain times when the Liberal Democrats were leading the polls. Why do you think there's been a bit of a decline in polling?
So I think as we get closer to the election time, the fact that we have a first past the post electoral system really starts to change behaviour, and it really starts to change the messaging from the other parties. I think tactically voting really comes in here at this point, and I think that's what we need to reform in order to get people in Parliament that really represent all the different views of people on the street. Because at the moment, a two-party state isn't really reflective of everyone's views across the country. The fact that we, 13 or 14% of the electorate would vote for us, but yet the SNP, for example, have 4%, but then they have so many more Westminster parliamentarians, it doesn't really weigh up for me, So I think that's what happens when it's a Westminster election. You get the tactical voting, and that tends to mean that we are less likely to see any great results, I think.
Do you think that because the SNP are the only really independence supporting party in Scotland, and the fact that there are a couple of different unionist parties, that this sometimes skews the vote when it comes to Westminster elections. As you mentioned, the SNP are doing, or going to do, if the polls are believed, quite well in Scotland in terms of electing MPs to Westminster. Do you think that that sort of split between the unionist parties is a problem when people come to vote?
So I think, it's difficult to say because, having spoken to the electorate, I don't think they see the Lib Dems necessarily as unionists because we're federalists. I think we have a good answer as to why we think maybe the system isn't working at the moment, but the answer isn't to get rid of Westminster like the SNP want to do. But yeah, I think I'm not sure that we would be splitting the vote for the unionists because I think the Tories' policies are so different to ours, and it's been clear when I've been at the hustings in front of the public. The questions that aimed at the Tories, are very specific about their policies and not really about the whole unionist thing. So yeah, I don't see that it's a split vote really from that perspective.
Now, the Labour Party has in the past been a party that has dominated Scottish politics and at the moment isn't doing particularly well. Do you think that there's an opening for the Liberal Democrats to take the place of the Labour Party in terms of Scottish politics as a sort of more, perhaps not left-wing party, but perhaps more centre-left party?
Yeah, I think so. I think Scotland is a liberal place, and I think that we would have a natural home and a natural vote here. There are obviously pockets of strong Labour support, but in some ways quite a lot of them have moved to vote for the SNP. But I do think that there's a strong liberal vote, and maybe it is some people that are disillusioned with Jeremy Corbyn, or it could be people that are disillusioned with the Tories as well. But I think historically that we have had there are lots of people that would vote Liberal, but because of the tactical voting they don't. So again, it's back to electoral system reform, I would say.
What do you think, aside from Brexit, is the most pressing issue in terms of Scotland and the Scottish electorate?
So it's interesting actually, because one of the things that I spoke about at conference and also have put as one of my key points within my literature is the benefit system and trying to move forward so that we end child poverty. And that is a question that came up at both public hustings that I was in last week as well. So it's obviously on people's minds in Edinburgh East as well. The rise in food banks, the botched rollout of universal credit. So I think that seems to be quite important to people at the moment, I would say. And then the Lib Dems obviously have a clear position on how to make it's a fairer share for all policy, and reversing some of the issues that have come out with universal credit, reversing some of the policies that impact children, like the 2-child limit, and also the bedroom tax. So I think we have put in place policies or put forward policies that would address the concerns that people have there.
What do you think is the reason, and I know you've worked both in the private and the public sector, what do you think is the reason that we are seeing such pressure being put on the NHS at the moment? Do you think it's simply a lack of funding going to it, or do you think that it's more to do with organisation and the management of the NHS?
So I definitely think more funding's needed, and I think that's something that we've pushed forward. Obviously NHS has devolved, health has devolved within Scotland, so it wasn't a key part of my campaign in Scotland, but nationally we definitely think more investment is needed, and we don't think a top-down reorganisation is what's needed, because there's been quite a lot of transformation over the last 10 years within the NHS. So what we need is more funding, and it needs to stay within, a public provided service. So yeah, I think it is a funding thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that the NHS is, of course, a devolved issue, and so is education, and the SNP have been held somewhat to task for their record on education over this election. Where do you think they have perhaps gone wrong in terms of education policy? So,
I mean, some of the things that they have tried to put in have been the right things. They've just been quite slow or missed targets. And I think maybe it's also a bit of a funding issue as well. So we have said that we will increase school budgets, and also make sure that we hire the right number of teachers, that we have, the sort of more exceptional teachers are paid maybe to work in the sort of more disadvantaged areas that really need that uplift. Make sure that we have the right deal for people at the younger ages as well, to make sure that the nurseries provision is provided as well, to allow working parents to go back to school. Working parents to go back to work after they've had their maternity leave. So I think funding and also missing targets and just being focused too much on independence has probably let the SNP down.
How important do you think it is that, as we come towards the end of this year and going into next year, that regardless of whether Brexit is revolved through the Prime Minister's deal or whatever the result is that we don't let it completely dominate our politics in the same way that it has done for the past few years?
So do you mean how do we move forward?
Yeah.
So I think it is quite hard. I mean, I think we're going to have to work together. I mean, it's difficult to say without knowing the outcome of what happens on the 12th, but there's definitely, the parties are going to have to work together to try and get something that, we can agree on, or else something bigger needs to change, some parties may end up being split up over this, and then that might actually in the longer term be good. And I think that's the sort of thing that might lead to electoral reform, because if we have more and smaller parties, then that's when PR would be much more, beneficial for everyone. So I think that's the kind of thing that I can see happening, hopefully. So, yeah.
Now, you mentioned the potential splitting up of parties and the forming of smaller parties, and we saw that earlier this year with several Labour MPs and then a few Conservative MPs leaving their respective parties and forming Change UK or the Independent Group, whatever. Do you think that the reason that we're seeing people leaving the traditional political parties is solely down to Brexit? Or do you think it's a sign of wider problems in our political system?
So I think the two big parties that we have, Labour and Conservative, they've both gone really far to the right or left. And I think, if we look at, the governments that lasted for quite a long time more recently, they were sort of more central Labour and more central Tory. So I think that's probably what's caused these people to object to the way that the parties have gone and say this doesn't align with my view anymore, therefore I need to step away and change party, or else go to a new party that's just formed, like with TIG. So I think it's because they've gone off in polar opposites. So I think that's probably why.
Do you think that, given that the parties are have gone to polar opposite sides, do you think that it's a bit surprising that the support for the Liberal Democrats hasn't necessarily shifted in the the way that you might have expected with the two parties going in such different directions?
Yes, I think that is true, but I think people are, again, because of the tactical voting thing, they're like, what's the lesser of two evils? I want my vote to count, because it's really important that, the people that want Brexit vote for Brexit, the people that don't vote for whatever party would be next there. So I just think that it's encouraging that sort of behaviour, to think I need to make sure that my vote counts, and it doesn't with the system that we have at the moment. So I think, I think the polar opposite thing maybe the whole referendum has turned people into extremes too, because it's sort of been so binary. So that's sort of gone along with how they're voting as well.
Do you think that tactical voting might perhaps skew the result of the general election in a way that doesn't necessarily demonstrate what people are feeling and what they're voting for? Because as you said, that in some instances it will be voting for the lesser of two evils rather than for their preferred choice.
Yes, because it has ended up being quite a Brexit-focused election. Although in Scotland, I think you'll see the Tories, their literature doesn't mention Brexit at all, because they know how unpopular that is in Scotland. But they just talk about, we need to keep Scotland as part of the UK, and that's kind of what their literature goes along with. But then hopefully people see through that and understand that, getting more Tories into Westminster will make Brexit more likely. But it's difficult to say. I think, the unrest is going to continue because people are voting maybe on one policy point, and then everything else then falls through. I don't know. It's just going to be difficult times, I think, even after the 12th.
I'd now like to just talk particularly about Edinburgh East. What do you think have been the issues that have been most important in Edinburgh East?
I mentioned earlier the child poverty questions that have been coming up quite a lot, and I think people are also very much concerned about Brexit. They're concerned about whether we're staying in the UK or not, and we also have, over the last 18 months, I have been going out, getting to know local people, doing regular door knocking as well as attending events. And there have been quite a lot of people talking about sort of the more day-to-day things that really bother them as well. So quite a lot of them are concerned about speeding and parking on pavements and these sorts of things too. So, we do sort of get it all when we're speaking to them. So I think the big things are bothering them, like the constitutional changes, as well as, how maybe that's been a distraction too, and has impacted people's day-to-day lives, where the council maybe haven't been picking up on things that they would have hoped they would be. And I think the point on climate change is really important to people in the East as well. I think they are very sort of climate aware, quite a lot of the areas within Edinburgh East. And I know people were wanting to speak in quite detail about our climate policies. So I think, to be honest, they've landed quite well, because we have been quite progressive with that. So,
what particular influence do you think the manifesto has had on the way people vote? Because I know, of course, that the Scottish Liberal Democrat manifesto is a bit different from the one in the rest of the UK, because, of course, there are certain issues that are devolved. Has it particularly influenced the way people vote, do you think?
It's difficult to say. Certainly when I'm knocking on doors, people say, oh, I will read through everything. That's not that they have already. So I'm not sure how many people do read the manifesto. Certainly, we talk through it at public hustings, but that's quite a limited number of people that go to those. But I think, it's part of the importance of the media to make sure that our key messages about our manifesto are getting out as well, and just to try and make sure that we are reinforcing that where we can. Most of the key points are covered in the Scottish version of the manifesto. But as you say, there's a few bits that are not in as much detail because they're devolved. But quite a lot of the additional funding and things would still come through from the Barnett formula anyway. So, yeah. But yeah, it's difficult to say how people are going to vote, whether it's going to be based on the manifesto or whether it's going to be based on what their next door neighbour thinks or what they've seen on the TV or what they've read in the newspaper. But we just have to cover all these bases if we can.
How much of an influence do you think that the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Joe Swinson, has on whether people may vote or may not vote for the Liberal Democrats?
So I think with Liberal Democrat voters, they've people that I've spoken to who have historically voted Liberal Democrat, they've always been really positive about Jo and think she's a breath of fresh air. And she's really strong. She's really clear in her messaging. Obviously, all the leaders are getting quite a lot of negative press. That seems to be what happens these days. And I think she's coming across as being really resilient to that and, staying strong. And I think that's landing well. People that maybe aren't Liberal voters that I speak to on the doors who they quite often say, oh, I'm not sure about her. But, they weren't going to vote Liberal anyway. So I'm not sure that they're putting she would be influencing negatively in that sense.
Now, when you were announced as the candidate, one of the things that you said that you would like to particularly take issue and fight against was the SNP's garden tax. Do you think you could explain that to viewers who are perhaps not aware of it?
Yeah, so the garden tax is something that has come up on the doors quite a lot. It's actually a council-led sort of thing that's moved forwards. I'm not sure whether, I think it's probably across the whole of Scotland, but certainly our Edinburgh councillors have fought to change the way that it's been implemented, because the garden tax is basically if you have a garden, as part of collecting, recycling, putting the bins out generally for general waste. There's also garden waste. And those people who wanted to put that out for the council to pick up would have to pay an annual fee. So therefore we're calling that, it's been called the garden tax. So, but it has been implemented in such a way that, bins have been going missing. So people haven't, even though they've paid for it, they're not able to actually put their garden waste out. And it just seems like a tax on people who have a garden. So our local councillors have been working to end that, because we don't think it's something that we should be asking people to pay.
Well, we're coming towards the end of the podcast. It's been great to have you on, Jill. And I'd just like to ask one final question. We're coming up to Christmas. This is a December election. We're recording this in December. So I would like to ask, what would you like for Christmas?
So I think for Christmas, I would like a Liberal government. After the general election, I think that would be great. It would allow us to implement all our policies, which I think would be something that would really greatly benefit society, and help people to have better and easier lives, which I think is really important and something that's maybe been a bit lacking since we had the Tory government. At a sort of more day-to-day level, I actually would really like a blender for making soup, because I've been making soup quite regularly, especially throughout this campaign, because I think getting nutrition in is really important. And a bit of it's broken off, and I don't think I'll be able to fix it. So I think that's on my Christmas list.
I think we can certainly wish you all the best with getting a new blender, hopefully, for Christmas as soon as you can. Thank you again for coming on and speaking to me.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
If you would like to listen to the podcast on iTunes, you can do. You can listen to it on Spotify, Spreaker, and YouTube. You can email us at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. And I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope you listen to the next one.